Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
When our president enunciates that satanic theme, this is the satanic empire, that resonates with a lot of people.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Thomas Murray, politician and attorney from Sandusky, Ohio. Father Bacik and Mr. Murray will discuss U.S.-Soviet relations, the religious dimension. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Tom, I'm glad you took time out from your busy schedule to speak with me a little bit. I want to talk about Soviet-U.S. relationships, and you're about the best man around I can think of to do that, since you have visited the Soviet Union and talked to the man in the street there and visited homes and so on. And so are you up to a little conversation on U.S.-Soviet relationships?
Yes, I am, Jim.
And I'm going to take off on the recent encyclical written by Pope John Paul II on social concerns. And in there he talks about the East-West relationship fundamentally between the Soviet Union and the United States, and points out the great impact it has on North-South relationships, on the developing countries. And in the encyclical, he talks about critiquing both liberal capitalism and the communist-type systems. And what it's created in the media is a lot of debate. In other words, the conservative commentators, Michael Novak being one, William Buckley and so on, have said the Pope has made a large error because he has set up a moral equivalence between the United States and the Soviet Union by saying that both of us have colonialist tendencies and there's a certain repressive element in each one and so on. Now, in turn, what people like Michael Novak have said, well, there's a big difference between the Soviet Union and the United States, because look at the question of religious freedom, religious liberty. And that takes me into the topic that I really want to explore with you, and I know you know a lot about, and that is, how are we going to judge this whole matter of moral equivalency? We have a whole notion of religious freedom here in the United States, and it'll be interesting to see how the Soviet Union looks in this regard. So that's the kind of debate I would like to get into here, a discussion. And you have some ideas on that you want to throw out here as we go along?
Well, I think you touched on a number of questions. This question of moral equivalency, of course, is one that takes us directly to the question of whether the Soviet state today should be deemed an atheistic, anti-humanistic, expansionistic, aggressive force. Now, if you reach that conclusion, that the principal thrust of Soviet policy in the world today is to conquer the world with secularist, Marxist doctrine and policies implementing that approach, then I think you'd have to come to the conclusion that we can start with the assumption that we are dealing with morally unequal parties. And therefore, if you make that assumption, then it seems to me that a whole series of conclusions follows from that.
Now, that is the assumption that most people make these days. I would say if you talk to the average person in the United States or take a poll, when our president enunciates that satanic theme, that this is the satanic empire, that resonates with a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people, because of their training and background, would simply assume that we wear the white hats and the Soviets wear the black hats in all negotiations and so on.
I think that's true, and I think that to even begin to discuss this intelligently, you have to recognize that frequently when politicians speak on this issue today, they deal with it at the most superficial levels. They deal with it as they view the broad contours of developments, for example, in the Soviet Union. Now, on the one hand, you can't deny the Soviet Union is officially an atheistic state, but that is oversimplified in my view. And you have to understand the Soviet state today. You have to understand that it is not just the Communist Party which is influencing policy in the Soviet state. But I would suggest that of all the institutions in the Soviet Union today which influence the outlook on all of the things that are basic to us, the meaning of life, attitude towards work, family, culture, history, the institution which is playing the greatest part, and historically has played the greatest part in those vital aspects of life in Russia, or the Soviet Union, if you prefer to call it that, is the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's interesting that we're talking about this subject today, Jim, because the year 1988 marks the 1,000th anniversary of the baptizing into Christianity of the Russian people on the banks of the Dnieper River in ancient Kiev. So we are dealing here with a Russian state whose history is bound up with the Russian Orthodox Church and has been influenced throughout its history by the relationship between the secular power in the first 980 years of its existence.
Maybe it'd be good for me to just say a little bit about the Orthodox churches in general, Orthodoxy as we have come to know it, and to set the stage for further discussion. I think one of the main differences that I see in their outlook is that they've always had a sense of the national church. In other words, as in the Eastern world generally, we've had an understanding of the universal church as being built up from the national grouping, so that the church around Constantinople or Alexandria and so on became the church for them. And they had a great sense of autonomy. And they considered the Pope always to be sort of among equals. They didn't want to give the Pope a tremendous primacy as standing way above all of the other patriarchs, the heads of the major cities and so on. So that their sense of Christian unity was that the national churches, the ones located around the major areas, geographical areas, would come together somehow to form the universal body of Christ. Where in the West we've had another sort of sense. We've begun with the unity. We've begun with the sense that there is a universal church, and then it begins to get embodied in the various countries, places around the world. And I think that maybe has given the Orthodox a very different sense of things growing out of that notion. So you're probably going to get much more of a nationalistic church, and I think my own reading would be that's what we're going to see when we look at the Soviet Union.
I think that's true, and I think you have hit on a distinctive feature of Russian Orthodoxy. Of course, all of the Russian Orthodox churches view themselves as a family bound not by a pope and not by an authoritarian figure with all that implies, but by a faith, a common faith, a common religious system of belief and practice. And you see that when you travel in the Soviet Union today. The top figure in the church is either a metropolitan or a patriarch or a local archbishop or bishop. But in a very real sense, the local churches are autonomous, and while there are common practices, their liturgy, for example, goes back to Byzantine liturgy and history, there is a good deal of local autonomy in the churches, and that raises all kinds of interesting questions about that have some counterpart here in the issues in the Roman Catholic Church today. For example, questions like the role of women in the Russian Orthodox Church. And believe it or not, parallel with the discussion going on in the secular state about glasnost and restructuring of the economy today, there's a very active discussion going on in the church about the role of women in the Soviet Union. Not so much in the Russian Orthodox Church, but in some of the other churches that we haven't even mentioned, the Baptist churches, the Roman Catholic churches, which are there in smaller numbers, but they're there nevertheless. And I think, Jim, if I might, just by way of perhaps getting down maybe even to more specific questions, I think it would be good to point out that when we talk about the Soviet Union, there are probably 3 times as many formal adherents to the Russian Orthodox Church as there are members of the Communist Party. Some people believe that there are probably 50 million members of the Russian Orthodox Church, whereas there are probably about 16 or 17 million members of the Communist Party.
I would guess that that's a startling figure to many people.
I think it is.
And if you'd begin to broaden that out about other groupings with strong religious convictions, for example, the Muslim community in the Soviet Union, which a community that's very strong, as I understand it, and has a great cohesiveness and so on, then the religious factor becomes even greater than one might suspect.
I think that's true, and I think we might even make it a little bit clearer for those who have not been studying this recently or in depth. When we talk, I think we should even be careful on our terms here. I've used the term Russia and Soviet Union. The term Soviet Union means, if I might use the Russian term just by way of explanation, if we put it in Russian, it means Soyuza Sovietsky Socialistichesky Respublik, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Those are 15 separate republics, and only one of those republics contains a majority of ethnic Russians. There are 100 different nationalities in the Soviet Union. The other 14 republics don't even have a majority of ethnic Russians. In many of those republics, as you've suggested, the majority of the population are Muslims, particularly in the Southeast Asian republics. So we have here an officially atheistic state, but nevertheless, that Communist Party, which is the hand inside the glove, which determines the policies, they nevertheless must govern a nation with 50 million adherents to Russian Orthodoxy and approximately 40 to 45 million members of the Muslim faith. So to suggest that they can dictate that people must totally ignore their religious beliefs, or in the case of the Russians, 1,000-year tradition of deep faith, a faith which the people identify with their life and their history and their tradition, suggests something that flies in the face of what we know is common human experience. And it isn't happening in the Soviet Union, and I would suggest if we explored it further, I could demonstrate to you today with hard facts, which we Americans like so much, statistics and so forth, that faith today in the Soviet Union is alive and in many respects may even be growing beyond anything which existed at the time the Soviet government came into power.
I've talked to other people who have visited the Soviet Union and have been surprised to go into the churches there, Baptist churches, Catholic churches in Moscow and so on, and in Leningrad, and to find so many people worshiping there, and to find such great faith. And of course those people do that at some price, which brings up the whole question of religious liberty, which would be sort of this test case. I mean, the people who are upset with the Pope's encyclical on social concerns and the suggestion that there's moral equivalency are saying, well, let's wait a second here. I mean, you might have religious people there in the Soviet Union, but you don't have religious freedom in the same way. I mean, we think of our system of government and how the religious communities have flourished in the United States under the First Amendment. You know, in our Catholic community, we're on record as saying, well, we don't want to have privilege religiously in this country, that we do so well with just freedom and openness. The church has flourished here because we have had the opportunity to grow and develop. I think even because there's been a certain competition among denominations and so on, that people have had to be on their toes and try to produce good sermons and homilies and good liturgies and make the congregation attractive and so on. So we certainly have flourished under our system here, and I think that generally American people think that, you know, this is one of the great blessings we've received. We don't have to worry about going to worship. There's complete freedom that way. We don't have the state watching us in some way as we go about all of this. I know there are critics on the left who will point to certain other examples of, for example, liberationist theologians right here in our state, Paul Knitter, for one, who's on the FBI rolls because of his involvement with liberation movements and so on. His dossier is kept by the FBI and so on. Anyway, I know you're going to hear voices on the left that say, well, wait a second, don't make this an ideal picture in the United States here. We do have generally religious freedom, but there's certain ways in which when churches get involved in the sanctuary movement, for example, that they are watched, or when religious people were thought to be Marxist or communist. J. Edgar Hoover was very worried about them, and kept them under close surveillance. But setting aside that kind of criticism from the what I would think of as the pretty extreme left in a way, we enjoy this religious freedom here. I think it was de Tocqueville, when he came to the United States, said that religion was our most important political institution. An interesting kind of comment, which suggests that the great role that religion, and it's freely lived out, plays in the United States, that we are part of the general debate and what goes on, that we have a voice in public policy and can help shape public opinion and so on. So there we begin to, the question probably sharpens a little bit. I mean, Michael Novak would want to shout out loud and clear to Pope John Paul II in his encyclical on social concerns, don't equate us, because freedom is so crucial to the human situation, that freedom is an essence of what we are as human beings, and if you're in a situation where that's denied or curtailed, you simply can't have the human spirit flourishing as it ought.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jim, I've met very few people who have a clear picture of what's actually happening and has happened in the Soviet Union as far as the relationship between church and state is concerned. And I think it might be worthwhile take just a minute to in a very briefly to overlook this, or to examine this for a moment. We know, of course, when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred and the Soviets came to power,
roughly in 1917.
Yes, 1917. They came to power with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin as their leader, and one of Lenin's famous dictum was that socialism, with the help of science, will help to disperse the fog of the workers' faith in a life after death. Well, it hasn't. It has not. One of the first things the Soviets did was viciously attack the churches. And the idea was that the churches basically were teaching people this pie-in-the-sky religion, and that was taking their eye off the immediate task of building a more humane and just state. And we
this
know
is the famous Marxist
the Marxist,
criticism.
the idea of religion as the opiate of the people. And we know, of course, that there were grave economic injustices in imperial Russia. On the one hand, we had the czars living these extravagant, opulent lives in their palaces, while millions of people, ordinary people, working people, were living in abject poverty, without education, without minimal housing and food, without access to medical care. And it's a proud boast of the Soviet state that they have eradicated illiteracy, and today people have housing and food and so forth. But the attack on the church hasn't succeeded. What happened was that in the name of socialism and a more just economic order, they attacked the churches as part of the doctrine of Marxist-Leninist teachings. Many churches were destroyed, others were turned into a museum. But by the same token, the leaders of the Communist Party, perhaps with the exception of Stalin, recognized that they could never lead the people, and the people would never ultimately accept the communist rule if they eradicated the churches or even attempted to eradicate the churches completely. So what they did was set up a constitution which calls for a rigid separation of church and state. Talking with the Soviet church people and unchurched people, members of the government, they will say that the Soviet Constitution guarantees freedom of conscience, and by what they mean is you can be a member of a church, you can go to church, and you can teach your children religion, and that's indeed what millions of people are doing. But let's not blink, as many people who have a hard attitude toward the Soviet Union have pointed out. By the same token, people, particularly during the Stalin and Khrushchev era, were penalized if it was known that they were practicing religion. They were penalized in the sense that they were not given the same job opportunities, particularly as members of the Communist Party were given. But slowly but surely, in time, that has been changing now. And recently I had an opportunity to talk with Metropolitan Juvenali of Moscow, who visited the United States and came to Columbus, and I spent a day with him. And he said that there really are, slowly but surely, changes taking place in relations between church and state. So that today it's rather amazing when we contemplate that it's not uncommon, for example, in some of the cathedrals in the big cities, for as many as 5,000 people to attend a liturgy today. The monasteries in the Soviet Union are turning away 100 applicants for the priesthood for every 60 that they are able to accept. So there's this tremendous pressure, and I suspect at the deepest level it's because the secular teachings of Marx and Lenin have failed to satisfy the deepest yearnings of the young people in the Soviet Union. And I saw, when I visited the churches, Jim, the Orthodox churches, the Armenian Orthodox churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the single Roman Catholic Church in Leningrad, I saw young people today, almost equal in number to the older people. That wasn't true 10 or 15 years ago.
There's a couple of points I'd like to pick up on in there. First, I'd like to affirm your notion of what happens in a secularized society. I think we've seen the same thing in the United States, that when you level off the world and deal with it only in a superficial way, where you have a one-dimensional world, that the religious longings come to the surface. They may come in strange ways, but I think we human beings are essentially religious creatures, and when it is suppressed or repressed in one way or another, it's going to break out. We have those infinite longings, and we simply need to symbolize them, bring them to the surface, make them visible in one way or another, celebrate them together. It becomes part of the basis for our hope. And I would think that in all of the repressive totalitarian societies, that sooner or later the religious impulse will take hold. I suspect the same thing is happening in China, as you are describing, as in the Soviet Union, and will continue to happen. So in that sense, the Marxist program and Lenin's approach ultimately is doomed to failure, simply on theological grounds and simply on an analysis of what human nature is really all about. We are religious creatures, and you cannot suppress that impulse forever. So that's how I would affirm what you were saying along that line. Now the other thing that I'm recalling and talking to other visitors of the Soviet Union was, when they met some of these people, they were describing the kinds of penalties that indeed they were still subject to. One was that they weren't able to travel. That's one of the great ways that the Soviet state tries to control its people, is to keep people within the society. So you can't travel, can't go out, and obviously a lot of these young people would love to do that and go around the world, visit the United States and so on. The other thing I heard was in terms of jobs, that very often one would not move up in any way or get a better job, or maybe subject to losing one's job if one was known as a Christian or as a worshiping person. You want to comment on that at all?
I think it's insightful, Jim, because I think you're touching on the contradiction between trying to satisfy the infinite longings of man's spirit with a finite doctrine such as Marxism is obviously failing. And so one of the great questions in the Soviet Union today is, how is the Soviet Union, despite the economic progress which it's made, and I think we need to give them credit for what they have achieved, but how is it now to overcome this terrible stagnation which threatens the progress which they have made? And I suggest that it's entirely possible that if Mr. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost takes effect, and if we have enough discussion, enough freedom of discussion, as is now taking place, as to the causes of the inertia within the economy, which are slowing down the absolutely necessary progress in the area of food and housing and consumer goods and so forth, that are so obviously lacking in the Soviet Union. If this discussion continues, sooner or later I think it's going to come around to the fact that until we recognize that it is not enough to preach at people about their civic duty to work hard. We must, if the Soviet Union is to succeed, we must recognize that it's somehow going to have to motivate people by recognizing the tremendous dignity of work. And we're going to have to recognize that there is this longing in people to express their individuality and their creativity. And so that is going to lead to, it seems to me, modifications along the lines of a free enterprise system. And so I think we're going to see, for example, that the Soviet party officials are not going to be able to use restrictions on travel, restrictions on advancement in job opportunities as a punishment for freedom of expression across the board, intellectual expression, political expression, religious expression, in all of its guises and manifestations. They're not going to be able to do that and yet motivate the Soviet people to work as hard as is going to be necessary if they're going to escape from the terrible inertia and the oppressive bureaucracy which besets the Soviet economy today.
That's an interesting thing. What you've really done is pull forth religion as a liberating force in human society and not a restrictive one. Instead of being an opiate, it would be seen as a catalyst. One of the ways I think religion can function, of course, is as motivation, as creativity, as opening up new horizons, and so on. That would be an interesting thing that the Soviet leadership would have to come to grips with, and to see how they're going to deal in their society with religion. It'd be interesting to see whether the Orthodox tradition has that kind of resources and strength in it to be able to move people. I mean, we think of that in terms of the Protestant ethic here in the United States. We have that Calvinistic notion that if you work hard, keep your nose to the grindstone, then you're going to be close to God, and being close to God then becomes part of your motivation for working hard. That has been a major factor in the United States. Now, Orthodoxy doesn't have that same sort of notion, I don't think, that you find in Protestantism, although I think it probably could be brought out of their tradition in other ways, their great sacramental sense that the world is filled with grace, and that might become part of their motivation for working better.
I think you're touching on something that probably is beyond the scope of what we can talk about here. But I would only say this, that rather than a Protestant ethic, which is fundamentally individualistic in its orientation, the Russian Orthodox ethic is fundamentally collective, in the sense that it ties man and family and community to Mother Russia, to the earth, to its history. And indeed, throughout the history of the Soviet Union, or Russia, and more accurately, because prior to 1917, as we pointed out, it would have been Russia. It was the Russian Orthodox Church, which time and time again saved Mother Russia from the Tartar Mongols, from destruction. As recently as the Second World War, Stalin had to call upon the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church to help the state survive the Nazi onslaught.
Well, Tom, you've helped us to broaden our vision, surely, of religion in the Soviet Union. I think that we began by saying there was sort of a monolithic outlook on the part of the United States, that the Soviet Union was this satanic figure, and that I think most of us thought that all the churches were closed and maybe nothing was going on religiously. And I think you've helped broaden our vision of that tremendously by pointing out the role that religion has played historically in the Soviet Union, and also bringing to light the potential for the future. That certainly, I think, is a notion of hope as we begin to contemplate the situation in Russia today.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Thomas Murray, who is an attorney and politician from Sandusky, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was U.S.-Soviet relations, the religious dimension. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.